This video is made for entertainment purposes only. I developed photographs that weren't meant to be seen by human eyes. Not for 40 years, anyway. Not until the forest had reclaimed what was left, until the stories had faded into local legend, until everyone who might have known the truth had either died or learned to keep their mouths shut. My name is Marcus Webb, and I'm a wildlife photographer. Or at least, that's what I tell people at dinner parties when they ask what I do. The truth is more complicated. The truth is that for the past 15 years, I've been chasing shadows through the Pacific Northwest, following rumors and whispers, investigating stories that most people dismiss as campfire tales meant to scare children. I've spent more nights alone in the wilderness than I have in my own bed. I've traced footprints that shouldn't exist. I've recorded sounds that don't match any known animal in North America. And until September 2019, I had absolutely nothing to show for it except a failing marriage, a dwindling bank account, and the growing certainty that I was wasting my life chasing something that probably didn't exist. Then I found the camera. And everything I thought I knew about the world, about what's possible, about what shares these ancient forests with us, shattered like glass. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. Let me tell you about the day that changed everything, and about the photographs that prove we've never been alone in these woods. The summer of 2019 was brutal in the Cascade Range. Forest fires had been raging since late June, consuming thousands of acres, turning the sky the color of rust, making the air thick enough to taste. By September, when the first autumn rains finally came, half the hiking trails in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest were still closed, the landscape scarred and smoking, the wildlife scattered. I'd been working on a documentary project about ecological recovery after wildfires, legitimate work for once, funded by a conservation grant that was keeping me solvent for a few more months. It was honest photography, the kind my ex-wife had begged me to focus on instead of chasing fairy tales, as she'd put it during one of our last arguments. But old habits die hard. I was camped near the North Fork Nooksack River, photographing the early stages of forest regeneration, when I heard the story that would pull me back into the world of shadows and whispers. I'd stopped at a ranger station to update my permits, and I overheard two rangers talking in low voices near the coffee maker. Third time this month someone's reported strange sounds up near Goat Mountain, one of them was saying. He was older, weathered, the kind of ranger who'd spent more years in the backcountry than in civilization. Always the same area. Always at night. Bears, the younger ranger replied dismissively. Or elk. People hear what they want to hear up there. Maybe. The older ranger didn't sound convinced. But Tom Brightwater called it in personally yesterday. And Tom's been guiding these mountains for 30 years. He knows the difference between a bear and something else. My ears had perked up at the name. Tom Brightwater was a legend among the local tribes, a Nooksack elder who'd guided researchers and hikers through these mountains since the 1970s. If Tom was reporting something unusual, it was worth paying attention to. I'd approached the rangers casually, introducing myself, explaining my documentary project. The older ranger, his name tag read Morrison, had studied me with sharp, assessing eyes. "You're that photographer," he'd said finally. "The one who's always looking for Sasquatch." I'd learned long ago not to deny it. Among other things. Morrison had glanced at his younger colleague, then back at me. Something in his expression shifted, like he was making a decision. "There's an old trail up near Goat Mountain," he'd said quietly. "Closed since the fires. Rock slide took out half the ridge, made it too dangerous for casual hikers." He'd paused, studying me. But if someone was careful, someone experienced, they might be able to access some areas that haven't been disturbed in decades. That someone wouldn't be violating any regulations, would they? I'd asked carefully. "Trails officially closed," Morrison had replied with the ghost of a smile. "But the closure ends at mile marker 7. What happens beyond that? Well, we can't enforce regulations in areas we've declared too dangerous to patrol." He'd drawn me a rough map on the back of a permit form, marking a narrow trail that branched off from the official path, winding up into higher elevations where the fires had burned hot and fast, consuming everything, then moving on. "If you go up there," he'd said, handing me the map, "be careful. The ground's unstable." And Marcus. He'd held my gaze. Tom Brightwater isn't the kind of man who calls and reports for attention. If he says something's up there, something's up there. I'd started the hike before dawn the next morning, my pack loaded with camera equipment, camping gear, and enough supplies for 3 days. The official trail was well maintained, carved through recovering forest where green shoots were already pushing up through the ash. But at mile marker 7, where the closure signs stood like sentinels, the character of the forest changed. Beyond the barriers, nature had reclaimed everything. The fire had swept through here with apocalyptic intensity, leaving behind a landscape of charred spires and exposed rock. The trail Morrison had marked was barely visible, more of a game path than anything humans had ever maintained. It wound upward through the devastation, following the contours of the mountain, heading toward higher elevations where the fire had eventually burned itself out. I'm in decent shape for a man pushing 40, but that climb tested me. The air was thin, the ground treacherous with loose ash and fire-weakened rock. Twice I had to detour around sections where the trail had simply collapsed, leaving nothing but sheer drops into burned-out gullies. But I kept climbing. Because this is what I do. This is what I've always done, even when it cost me everything else in my life. Some people are driven by ambition, by money, by the need for recognition. I'm driven by questions. By the absolute certainty that there are things in this world we don't understand, creatures we share this planet with that we've never properly acknowledged. And I'm driven by the possibility, however slim, that I might be the one to finally prove it. I reached the ridge Morrison had marked just before noon. The landscape opened up here, revealing a vast cirque, a natural amphitheater carved by ancient glaciers. The fire had swept through in a perfect crescent, burning everything on the south-facing slopes but leaving the northern face relatively untouched. It was like looking at 2 different worlds, death and devastation on one side, surviving old-growth forest on the other. And there, right at the boundary between the 2 worlds, perched on the edge of what looked like a recent rockslide, I saw something glinting in the sunlight. Something metal. Something that didn't belong. Getting to it was dangerous. The rockslide was fresh, probably triggered by the fires weakening the underlying structure, then finished by the autumn rains. Loose scree covered what had once been a stable cliff face, and every step I took sent small cascades of stones skittering down into the void below. But I've never been particularly good at walking away from mysteries. I made my way across slowly, testing each foothold, using my hiking poles for balance. The metallic glint grew closer, resolving into something I hadn't expected, a camera. Not a modern digital camera, but an old film camera, a Pentax K1000, if I wasn't mistaken. The body was battered, covered in rust and lichen, the leather grip rotted away to nothing. It was wedged into a crevice in the rock, partially buried in soil and decomposed organic matter, as if it had been there for years. Decades, maybe. My hands were shaking as I carefully extracted it from its resting place. The camera was heavier than I expected, solid metal construction from an era when cameras were built to last. The lens was shattered, spiderwebbed with cracks, but the body seemed relatively intact despite the obvious age and exposure. And most importantly, the back was still sealed. There was film inside. I sat down carefully on the most stable rock I could find and examined my discovery more closely. The camera showed signs of impact damage, dents and scrapes that suggested it had fallen from height, probably during the rockslide. But the seal on the film compartment had held. 40 years of exposure to the elements, and somehow, impossibly, the seal had held. On the side of the camera, partially obscured by rust, I could make out an inscription scratched into the metal. J. Mercer, Summer, 83. 1983. 36 years ago. This camera had been up here, lost or abandoned, for 36 years. And inside it, protected by nothing more than a light-tight seal and luck, was film that had been waiting nearly 4 decades to be developed. I've found lost cameras before. It's not uncommon in the wilderness. People drop things, accidents happen, equipment gets left behind. Usually, the film is ruined, destroyed by moisture and time. But occasionally, just occasionally, you get lucky. I once developed a roll that had been lost for 5 years and managed to recover a dozen images. But 36 years? That was unprecedented. I should have hiked back down right then. I should have taken the camera to a professional lab, let experts handle the development. But I was 3 hours from my truck, and another 2 hours from the nearest town, and the possibility that this film might contain something remarkable, something related to the reports Tom Brightwater had been making, was burning in my mind like a fever. I made camp right there on the ridge, in the transitional zone between burned forest and surviving old growth. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and as the sun began to set behind the western peaks, I sat holding that rusted camera and wondering about Jay Mercer, who'd been hiking these mountains in the summer of 1983. Had they dropped the camera accidentally? Or had something happened up here, something that had made them leave in a hurry? And more importantly, what had they photographed? I need to explain something about my equipment before I continue. Most wildlife photographers today work exclusively with digital cameras. Instant results, unlimited shots, easy editing. But I've always maintained a hybrid approach, partly because I'm old school, and partly because there's something about film that digital can never quite replicate. The grain, the depth, the way light interacts with emulsion. It has a quality that matters when you're trying to document something people don't want to believe exists. So I travel with a portable darkroom setup, a changing bag, developing chemicals, a compact enlarger, and a dozen other tools that let me process film in the field. It's excessive, I know. It adds 15 pounds to my pack. But it saved me more than once when I've captured something time-sensitive, something that couldn't wait for the journey back to civilization. That night, under the cold stars of the Cascade Range, I set up my makeshift darkroom in the tent. I mixed chemicals by headlamp, measured by memory and experience, working with the kind of focused precision that meditation teachers spend lifetimes trying to achieve. The hardest part was extracting the film from the camera without exposing it to light. 36 years of potential images, protected by a seal that somehow, miraculously, had survived everything nature could throw at it. If I screwed this up, if I let even a fraction of light in during the extraction, those images would be gone forever. I worked inside the changing bag, my hands hidden inside the light-proof fabric, feeling my way through the process by touch alone. The camera back was corroded, the latch stiff with rust. For a terrible moment, I thought it wouldn't open, that I'd have to choose between forcing it and risking damage to the film, or giving up entirely. Then, with a soft crack, the latch gave way. The film canister inside was intact, a Kodak Tri-X 400, a classic black and white film that was popular in the early 80s. High contrast, good grain, excellent for low-light situations. Professional choice, or at least serious amateur. J. Mercer had known what they were doing. I extracted the film carefully, loaded it onto a developing reel, and sealed it in my portable developing tank. Then, finally, I could turn the lights back on and begin the actual development process. This is always the moment I love most. The alchemy of it, the transformation of silver halide crystals into images, of potential into reality. You pour in the developer, start the timer, agitate the tank in precise rhythms, and wait. You can't see what's happening inside that light-tight container, can't know if anything's working until the process is complete. It's an act of faith. I processed that film with more care than I'd ever processed anything in my life. Developer for 8 minutes, stop bath for 1 minute, fixer for 5 minutes, then a long wash in purified water for my filter. Each step performed with ritualistic precision, because I knew, somewhere deep in my gut I knew, that this film contained something important. When the washing cycle was complete, I hung the negatives to dry from a line I'd strung across the tent. They swayed gently in the slight breeze that made it through the tent vents, glistening wet, dark strips of film covered in images I still couldn't quite make out. I forced myself to wait. Forced myself to lie down in my sleeping bag, to close my eyes, to let the film dry properly before examining it. But sleep was impossible. Every few minutes, I'd turn on my headlamp and check the negatives, watching as the excess water evaporated, as the images slowly came into focus. I made my first contact prints at 2:37 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch, some part of me understanding that this moment might be important to document. Contact prints are simple. You lay the negatives directly onto photographic paper, expose them to light, then develop the paper. What you get is a positive image, same size as the negative, showing you exactly what the camera captured. It's a quick way to see what you're working with before committing to enlargements. I had 36 exposures on that roll of film. 36 frames that Jay Mercer had shot during the summer of 1983, high in the Cascade Range, shortly before losing their camera to a cliff edge. The first dozen frames were standard wilderness photography. Beautiful shots, technically competent, a sunrise over distant peaks, a marmot on a rock, wildflowers in an alpine meadow. The kind of images any good nature photographer might take. They confirmed what I'd suspected. J. Mercer had known their way around a camera. Frames 13 through 18 showed a campsite. A small blue tent pitched in a clearing, a campfire ring, hiking gear laid out to air. Solo camping, by the look of it. One tent, one sleeping bag visible, one set of boots. Frame 19 was where things changed. It showed the edge of the forest at dusk, trees casting long shadows across the clearing. And there, partially obscured by branches but unmistakable once you saw it, was a shape that didn't belong. A large shape. A watching shape. My hands were shaking as I moved to frame 20. The shape was closer now, emerged from the tree lean but still in shadow. Bipedal. Enormous. Covered in dark fur that caught the last light of the setting sun. Frame 21. Closer still. The detail was better now, though still somewhat blurred by shadow and distance. But I could make out the general form, human-like in its basic structure, but massively built, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. The proportions were wrong for a human, the shoulders too broad, the arms too long. Frame 22 nearly stopped my heart. It showed the creature in clear focus, no more than 20 feet from where the photographer must have been standing. Evening light fell directly on its face, and it was a face, not an animal's muzzle, but a face that conveyed intelligence, curiosity, emotion. Dark eyes that caught the light and reflected it back at the camera. A broad nose, a mouth that was neither quite human nor quite ape, something in between. And the expression on that face. I'd seen thousands of wildlife photographs in my career. I'd studied animal behavior, learned to read body language and facial expressions across species. This was neither the blank stare of a predator nor the empty gaze of prey. This was curiosity. Active, intelligent curiosity. The creature was studying the photographer the same way the photographer was studying it. I sat in my tent at 3 in the morning, staring at frame 22 by the light of my headlamp, trying to process what I was seeing. Trying to reconcile the image on the paper with everything I'd been told was possible, with everything the scientific establishment insisted couldn't exist. But the evidence was right there in my hands. Chemical reactions on silver halide crystals don't lie. They don't hallucinate. They don't misidentify bears or people in costumes. They record exactly what was in front of the lens when the shutter opened and closed. And what had been in front of J. Mercer's lens in the summer of 1983 was something that shouldn't exist. Something extraordinary. I forced myself to continue through the sequence, though part of me wanted to stop, to preserve this moment of possibility before reality could complicate it further. Because I knew what came next in any mysterious sequence of photographs, the inevitable letdown, the revelation that explains everything away, the prosaic truth that replaces wonder with disappointment. But that's not what happened here. Frame 23 showed the creature taking a step forward, one massive hand extended, palm open. Not threatening, the body language was all wrong for aggression. The posture was careful, cautious, almost gentle. Like someone approaching a skittish animal, not wanting to frighten it. Frame 24, the hand was clearer now, filling more of the frame. I could see details that made my breath catch, an opposable thumb, clearly articulated fingers, nails not claws. The palm showed distinct fingerprints, visible even in the photograph, even across 36 years. The hand was enormous, easily twice the size of a human hand, but the structure was fundamentally similar. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't have hands like that. This wasn't a costume. I've seen enough hoax photographs to know what costume fur looks like, how it moves, how light interacts with it. The creature in these images had real fur. I could see individual hairs, see the way they caught the light, see the natural variation in color and length. No costume from 1983 had that level of detail. Frame 25 showed the creature from a lower angle, as if the photographer had either crouched down or perhaps stumbled backward. The composition was less controlled than the earlier shots, slightly off balance, suggesting movement, urgency, maybe fear. But the creature's expression hadn't changed. Still that same look of careful curiosity, of intelligent assessment. And then frame 26 changed everything again. The photograph showed both the creature and the photographer's campsite in the background. But the creature wasn't looking at the camera anymore. Its head was turned, angled upward toward the cliff face that rose behind the clearing. And its expression had transformed, the curiosity replaced by what I can only describe as alarm. Frame 27 was blurred, badly out of focus, as if taken in haste. But I could make out the creature's posture, turned fully away from the camera now, looking up at the cliff, body language tense, alert. Frame 28, the creature's arm raised, pointing. Definitely pointing. There was no ambiguity about the gesture. Pointing up toward the cliff face with unmistakable urgency. Frame 29 was the most technically imperfect image of the sequence, badly framed, motion blurred, obviously taken in a panic. But it showed something crucial. The creature had moved closer to the photographer, closing the distance between them in what must have been seconds. And it wasn't just pointing anymore. It was reaching toward the photographer. Not grabbing, not attacking, reaching. The way you'd reach for someone you were trying to pull to safety. Frame 30 was taken from a completely different angle, as if the photographer had been spun around or had turned violently. It showed the cliff face behind the campsite, the same cliff face the creature had been pointing toward. And I could see what the creature had seen. The rock face was fracturing. Even frozen in a still photograph from 36 years ago, I could see the pattern of cracks spiderwebbing across the stone, could see the slight displacement that indicated the beginning of a major structural failure. The cliff was coming down. Frame 31 showed the creature's face in extreme close-up, so close that it must have been within arm's reach of the photographer. The expression was undeniable, urgent, almost frantic. The mouth was open, as if it had been making sounds, trying to communicate. Trying to warn. Frame 32. Chaos. A blur of motion, impossible to parse clearly, but I could make out fragments. The creature's fur, the photographer's tent beginning to collapse, something large and dark falling from above. Frame 33. Similar chaos, but the angle suggested the photographer was running now, the camera swinging wildly, capturing random fragments of the disaster unfolding around them. Frame 34 was tilted at a 45-degree angle, showing ground rushing past, boots visible at the edge of the frame, definitely running, definitely fleeing. Frame 35 showed the cliff face mid-collapse, tons of rock in freefall, trees at the base beginning to topple inward. And frame 36, the last image on the roll, showed the creature one final time. It was in profile, silhouetted against the chaos of the landslide, and it was also running. Not toward the photographer, but parallel, racing through the forest with a speed and grace that shouldn't have been possible for something so massive. The last image Jay Mercer had captured before losing their camera was of the creature that had tried to save their life, fleeing the same disaster it had warned them about. I sat in my tent as the sky outside began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, surrounded by contact prints that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. My hands were still shaking, and not from the cold. The sequence was extraordinary. Not just because it showed clear, detailed photographs of a creature science insisted didn't exist, but because of what it documented. An interaction, a communication, an attempt at rescue. This wasn't the typical Bigfoot evidence, the blurry figure glimpsed at a distance, the ambiguous footprint in mud. This was a narrative, captured frame by frame, showing intelligence, compassion, and an awareness of danger that had potentially saved a human life. But the implications were staggering. And the questions were overwhelming. Who was Jay Mercer? Had they survived the landslide? If so, why had they never come forward with this evidence? And if they hadn't survived, if they'd been caught by the rockfall, why had no one ever found them? I needed to know more. Needed to understand what had happened up here in the summer of 1983, and what had become of the photographer who'd captured these remarkable images. I spent the next hour making high-resolution scans of the negatives using my portable scanner. It was painstaking work, but I wasn't about to leave this mountain with these images existing in only one format. By the time I finished, I had digital backups stored on 3 separate devices, encrypted and secured. Then I carefully packed the original negatives in archival sleeves, sealed them in a waterproof container, and added them to my pack. Whatever else happened, I was going to protect this evidence. The sun was fully up by then, revealing the cirque in clear morning light. I climbed out of my tent and stood at the edge of the ridge, looking down at the rockslide scar below. The landslide in the photographs had happened 36 years ago, but I could still see its path. A diagonal gash across the cliff face, wider at the top, narrowing as it descended, ending in a massive debris field at the bottom. Somewhere down there, potentially, were the remains of J. Mercer's campsite. Maybe even remains of J. Mercer themselves. I knew what I should do. The responsible thing would be to hike back down, contact the rangers, report what I'd found. Let authorities handle the investigation. Let professionals search for any potential remains. Let the system work the way it was supposed to. But I also knew what would happen if I did that. The photographs would be confiscated as evidence. They'd disappear into files, get examined by skeptical officials who'd find reasons to dismiss them. The story would leak, media would descend. The site would be contaminated by sensation seekers and hoaxers. Any chance of understanding what had really happened here would be lost in a circus of competing agendas. So I made a different choice. I was going down into that debris field. I was going to search for any trace of J. Mercer, any additional evidence that might explain this sequence of events. And I was going to do it now, before anyone else knew what I'd found. The route down to the debris field was treacherous. The landslide had been major. I estimated several thousand tons of rock had come down, based on the size of the scar and the spread of debris below. The forest at the base had been devastated. Mature trees snapped like matchsticks, the ground buried under layers of fractured stone. But 3.5 decades of plant growth had softened the impact. Young alders had colonized the debris field, their roots working into cracks, slowly breaking down the rock. Moss covered the larger boulders. The forest was reclaiming its own. I worked my way down slowly, using my hiking poles for stability, testing each foothold carefully. The morning was cool and clear, the air sharp with the scent of pine and stone. Somewhere above me, a raven called out, its voice echoing off the cliff face. The campsite location was harder to identify than I'd expected. 36 years of growth and change had transformed the landscape. But I had the photographs, and I could use them as a map. I pulled up the digital scans on my phone, comparing angles and background features to my current location. The distinctive split pine in frame 19 was still there, older now, but unmistakable in its shape. Using that as a reference point, I triangulated approximately where J. Mercer's tent had been pitched. The area was buried under 3 feet of rock and soil, covered now by a dense thicket of young alders. But as I began carefully probing the ground with a folding shovel I'd brought, I started finding artifacts. First, a piece of blue nylon fabric, faded and rotted but still recognizable as tent material. Then a twisted aluminum tent pole. A crushed cooking pot. The brass zipper from a sleeping bag, green with oxidation but still intact. I was in the right place. I worked carefully, methodically, expanding my search in a grid pattern. I wasn't trained in forensic archaeology, but I understood the basic principles. Document everything, disturb as little as possible, preserve context. I photographed each find in situ before collecting it, marked locations with GPS coordinates, created a detailed map of the site. 3 hours into the search, I found something that made my blood run cold. Bones. Human bones. They were partially buried under a flat slab of stone, protected from scavengers by the weight of the rock. A femur, unmistakably human in proportion. Ribs. Vertebrae. And a skull, fractured but largely intact, the bone weathered and stained but preserved by the particular chemistry of the soil. J. Mercer hadn't made it out. The landslide they'd been warned about, the disaster they'd been running from, it had caught them anyway. Despite the creature's warning, despite their attempt to flee, the sheer scale of the rockfall had been too massive, too fast. I sat back on my heels, staring at the skull, feeling the weight of tragedy settle over me. This person had come up into these mountains seeking beauty, seeking adventure, seeking the kind of wilderness experience that feeds the soul. They'd encountered something extraordinary, something that had tried to save their life. And they'd died anyway. But they'd left behind evidence. They'd captured proof of something remarkable, and they'd kept that camera with them even as they ran, even in those final chaotic moments. The camera had survived, had protected its film through sheer chance and the physics of how it landed, where it lodged. J. Mercer was gone, but their final gift to the world had survived. I pulled out my satellite phone and stared at it for a long time, weighing my options. I could call this in now, report the remains, let officials handle the recovery. It was the ethical thing to do, the legal thing to do. But I also knew that once I made that call, I would lose control of this story. The photographs would become evidence in an investigation. They'd be locked away, potentially for years. The remarkable nature of what they showed might be lost entirely in bureaucratic processes. J. Mercer deserved better than that. I made my decision. I spent the rest of that day carefully documenting the site, photographing everything from multiple angles, collecting the artifacts that might tell me more about who J. Mercer had been. Then I covered the remains carefully with stones and branches, marking the location precisely in my GPS, and hiked back up to my camp. I would report the remains, but not yet. Not until I understood the full story. Not until I knew what had happened to bring J. Mercer up to this remote ridge in the summer of 1983, and why no one had ever searched for them when they didn't come home. That night, I descended back to civilization. I didn't sleep. Instead, I drove through the darkness back to my apartment outside Seattle, my mind racing with plans and questions. The next morning, I began researching J. Mercer. It took 3 days of intensive investigation, searching old newspaper archives, digging through missing persons databases, making phone calls to local historical societies and ranger stations. But eventually, I found the story. Joshua Mercer, 28 years old in the summer of 1983. A freelance photographer based out of Bellingham, Washington, known for his wilderness photography and his quiet, solitary nature. He'd told his landlord he was going on an extended hiking trip into the Cascades, planning to be gone for 2 weeks, shooting for a book project about old-growth forests. When he didn't return after 3 weeks, the landlord had contacted authorities. A search had been organized, but it was half-hearted at best. Joshua had been vague about his exact plans, and the Cascade Range is vast. After a week of searching common trails and finding nothing, the effort had been called off. Joshua was listed as missing, presumed dead in a wilderness accident, and the case had gone cold. No one had known about the Goat Mountain area. No one had thought to search there. And so Joshua Mercer had lain under tons of rock for 36 years, his final photographs undiscovered, his extraordinary encounter with the impossible documented but unseen. Until now. I found his sister, Maria Mercer Thompson, living in Portland. She was 62 now, and when I called her, explained who I was and that I'd found evidence related to her brother's disappearance, there was a long silence on the phone. After all these years, she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. I'd given up hope of ever knowing what happened to him. We met 2 days later at a coffee shop in Portland. I brought the photographs. Maria Mercer Thompson was a small woman with silver hair and her brother's eyes, dark, intelligent, curious. She arrived at the coffee shop carrying a worn leather portfolio, and we found a quiet corner booth where we could talk privately. Joshua was my younger brother, she told me, spreading old photographs on the table between us. Brilliant, sensitive, completely obsessed with the wilderness. He could have been a successful commercial photographer. He had the talent. But he only wanted to photograph wild places, untouched places. He said that's where truth lived. I nodded, understanding completely. I'd been driven by similar obsessions. The summer he disappeared, he'd been acting strangely, Maria continued. Excited, but also secretive. He told me he'd heard stories from some of the native guides he worked with, stories about something in the high country. He wouldn't say what exactly, but I could tell it had captured his imagination. Did he ever mention Bigfoot? I asked carefully. Or Sasquatch? Maria smiled sadly. He didn't have to mention it specifically. I knew Joshua. I knew how his mind worked. He'd been reading everything he could find about cryptids, about unexplained sightings. I thought, she paused, her voice catching. I thought he was being foolish. Chasing legends. I told him he was wasting his talent. She looked down at the photographs of her brother, young and alive and full of dreams. That was the last real conversation we had. He left 2 days later for his trip, and he never came home. For 36 years, I've lived with the guilt of those being my last words to him. I understood then why I'd been so driven to find answers before contacting authorities. Because this wasn't just about evidence or scientific proof. It was about a man who'd died chasing truth, and a sister who'd lived for decades with unanswered questions. I opened my portfolio and carefully laid out the contact prints. "Maria," I said quietly, "your brother found what he was looking for, and he documented it." Her hands shook as she picked up the first photograph, the one showing the creature emerging from the tree-line. She studied it in silence, then moved to the next, and the next, working through the sequence with tears streaming down her face. When she reached frame 31, the creature's face in close-up, the expression of urgent warning, she let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "He was trying to save Joshua," she whispered. "This creature, this impossible thing, it saw the danger and tried to warn him." "Yes," I confirmed. The landslide happened seconds after these photographs were taken. Joshua was running, trying to get clear. He almost made it. Maria was quiet for a long time, studying the images, particularly that last one of the creature running through the forest, trying to escape the same disaster. Finally, she looked up at me. "What are you going to do with these photographs?" It was the question I'd been wrestling with for days. The question that had kept me up nights, weighing options, considering consequences. "That depends," I said carefully, "on what you think Joshua would have wanted." Maria looked back down at the images, at her brother's final work, his last gift to the world. "Joshua believed in truth," she said softly. "He believed that some truths are more important than personal safety or comfort. He went into those mountains knowing it was dangerous, knowing he might not come back, because he thought the truth was worth the risk." She gathered the photographs carefully, stacked them in order, and pushed them back across the table to me. "Show the world," she said firmly. "Show them what Joshua found. Show them what tried to save his life. Let his work matter." The next week was a whirlwind of activity and careful planning. I couldn't just post the photographs online and hope for the best. That would invite instant dismissal, accusations of hoaxing, and potential legal complications. I needed to build a case, present the evidence properly, and do justice to both Joshua Mercer's memory and the significance of what he'd documented. First, I contacted Dr. Ellen Rodriguez, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Washington who I'd worked with on previous documentary projects. I showed her the photographs and told her about the remains I'd found. She agreed to accompany me back to the site, to properly recover and identify Joshua's remains, and to provide professional authentication of the circumstances. Then I reached out to Dr. James Chen, a primatologist and professor of evolutionary biology who'd written extensively about the theoretical possibility of undiscovered hominids in North America. Unlike many in the mainstream scientific community, Dr. Chen had argued that the Pacific Northwest provided sufficient ecological niches and resources to potentially support a small population of large, intelligent primates. I showed him the photographs without telling him their provenance, asking only for his professional assessment of what they showed. His analysis took 3 hours. He examined every frame through magnifying equipment, measuring proportions, analyzing anatomical details, studying the way light interacted with the fur, the biomechanics of the creature's movement. Finally, he sat back and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "These are either the most sophisticated hoax I've ever seen," he said slowly, "or they're the most significant zoological discovery of the century. Where did you get these?" I told him the whole story, finding the camera, developing the film, discovering Joshua's remains, meeting Maria. I showed him my documentation of the site, the GPS coordinates, the artifacts I'd recovered. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long time. Then, "We need to recover those remains. We need to conduct a thorough search of that entire area. And we need to do this right, scientifically, carefully, with proper documentation every step of the way." "I know," I said. "That's why I came to you." He studied the photographs again, particularly the frames showing the creature's hand, its face, its expression of concern. "If these are real," he said quietly, "if this creature exists, then it changes everything. Not just biology or anthropology, but our entire understanding of what shares this planet with us. The ethical implications alone." He trailed off, still staring at the image of the creature's face. "They tried to save him," Dr. Chen said, echoing Maria's words. "This being, whatever it is, saw a human in danger and attempted a rescue. That's not animal behavior. That's not even just intelligence. That's empathy. That's moral reasoning." 3 weeks later, a small expedition returned to the Goat Mountain area. We kept it small deliberately. Dr. Rodriguez and 2 of her graduate students for the forensic work, Dr. Chen and a wildlife biologist colleague, a professional videographer to document everything, and me. The rangers knew we were coming this time. Morrison, the ranger who'd first pointed me toward the area, had been instrumental in getting us permits and access. When I'd shown him the photographs privately, his reaction had been surprisingly calm. "Tom Brightwater told me 30 years ago that there was something up in those mountains," Morrison had said quietly. "Something that watches, something that thinks." I never quite believed it. But I never quite disbelieved it either. The recovery of Joshua Mercer's remains took 2 days. Dr. Rodriguez worked with meticulous care, documenting every bone, every artifact, mapping the entire site. The graduate students sifted through soil, searching for additional evidence, any fragment that might tell us more about Joshua's final moments. Meanwhile, Dr. Chen and I searched the surrounding area, looking for any current evidence of the creatures that had lived here. Footprints, hair samples, any sign that they were still present in these mountains. We found plenty. A line of footprints in soft ground near a creek, each one measuring 17 inches long. Distinct toe marks, a clear heel strike, a walking pattern that showed bipedal locomotion with a gait very different from human. Hair samples on a tree where something had apparently rubbed its back. Coarse, dark hair that DNA analysis would later show to be from an unknown primate species, neither human nor any known ape. And most remarkably, what Dr. Chen identified as a possible shelter structure, branches deliberately woven together in the hollow beneath a massive cedar root system, creating a dry space just large enough for something very large to rest in. "They're still here," Dr. Chen said, photographing the structure from every angle. "The population might be small, but they're still here." On the 3rd day, something extraordinary happened. We were packing up our equipment, preparing to hike back down with Joshua's remains secured in a specialized transport container, when the wildlife biologist, a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, suddenly held up her hand for silence. We all froze. She pointed toward the tree lean, about 50 yards distant. And there, partially obscured by the shadows of the old-growth forest, something was watching us. I've tried many times to describe what I saw in those few seconds, and I've never felt like I've done it justice. Words feel inadequate for that moment. For the shock of recognition, the overwhelming sense of presence, the feeling that something vast and ancient was assessing us with an intelligence equal to our own. The creature was partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir, but I could make out the general shape. Tall, broad-shouldered, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was watching us with an utterly still intensity, the way you might watch something fascinating but unpredictable. Dr. Chen reached slowly for his camera. The videographer already had his camera running. He'd been filming the packing process, and now he panned smoothly toward the tree lean. None of us spoke. We barely breathed. The creature watched us for perhaps 15 seconds, though it felt like much longer. Then, in a movement so fluid it was almost graceful, it turned and melted back into the forest. One moment it was there, the next it was simply gone, leaving behind only the swaying of branches and the absolute certainty that what we'd witnessed was real. We stood in stunned silence for a full minute before anyone spoke. "Did everyone see that?" Sarah finally asked, her voice shaking. We all had. "Did the camera get it?" Dr. Chen asked. The videographer checked his footage, rewound it, played it back. And there it was, brief, partially obscured, but unmistakable. A large bipedal creature, watching us from the tree lean, then turning and disappearing into the forest. Dr. Rodriguez, the forensic anthropologist, sat down heavily on a nearby rock. "In 30 years of academic work," she said slowly, "I have never once deviated from strict materialist science. I believe in evidence, in testable hypotheses, in peer review. But I just saw something that shouldn't exist." "No," Dr. Chen corrected gently. "You saw something that we've been told doesn't exist. That's different. The evidence has always been there, we've just refused to accept it." He looked back toward the tree-line where the creature had stood. "They're real. They've always been real. And they've been watching us, studying us, staying hidden from us, for as long as we've been in these mountains. We came down from that mountain changed. All of us. You can't witness something that fundamentally challenges your understanding of reality and remain the same person you were before." Dr. Rodriguez, who'd built her entire career on strict empirical methodology, spent the hike down in contemplative silence. Sarah Chen kept looking back over her shoulder, as if hoping for another glimpse. And Dr. Chen walked with the focused intensity of someone whose life's work had just been validated in the most profound way possible. As for me, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and responsibility. I'd spent 15 years chasing shadows, sacrificing relationships and financial security for the possibility that something extraordinary existed in these forests. And now I had proof. Not just the photographs from 1983, but contemporary footage, physical evidence, DNA samples, and the testimony of multiple credentialed scientists. But proof brings complications. We spent the next month in intensive preparation before going public. Dr. Rodriguez worked with forensic odontology specialists to positively identify Joshua Mercer's remains through dental records, a process that brought official closure to a 36-year-old missing persons case. The local authorities were briefed, Maria was kept informed every step of the way, and arrangements were made for Joshua's remains to be cremated according to his sister's wishes. Meanwhile, Dr. Chen coordinated with geneticists at 3 separate universities to analyze the hair samples we'd collected. The results were consistent across all 3 labs. The DNA was from a primate species, sharing approximately 98.7% genetic similarity with humans, closer than chimpanzees, but distinctly not human. The samples showed markers suggesting a divergence from the human lineage somewhere between 3 and 5 million years ago. An entirely separate evolutionary branch. A sister species that had evolved alongside us, adapted to these northern forests, survived the ice ages and climate changes and human expansion, remaining hidden through sheer intelligence and deliberate avoidance. The videographer, his name was Marcus Liu, and he'd filmed documentaries for National Geographic, spent weeks editing our footage, creating a comprehensive visual record of the expedition. The brief clip of the creature watching us was analyzed frame by frame, enhanced through every technological means available. The result was still not perfect. The creature had been too far away, too obscured by vegetation, but it was clear enough to show undeniable physical presence. And through all of this, I worked on presenting Joshua Mercer's photographs in a way that would honor both their scientific significance and the man who'd taken them. I created high-resolution prints, professionally mounted and displayed in sequence. I wrote detailed technical documentation explaining the camera, the film, the development process, and the authentication measures we'd taken. I compiled a comprehensive report including the site documentation, the forensic findings, the DNA analysis, and witness statements from everyone involved in the expedition. But more than that, I tried to tell Joshua's story. To present him not as a random victim of wilderness tragedy, but as a serious photographer and thoughtful human being who'd gone into those mountains seeking truth, who'd found something extraordinary, and who'd documented it with both technical skill and apparent compassion even in moments of extreme danger. Because that's what struck me most about the sequence of photographs. Not just that they showed an unknown creature, but the way they showed it. There was no sensationalism in Joshua's framing, no attempt to make the creature look monstrous or threatening. He'd photographed it the way you'd photograph any other wildlife subject. With respect, with careful attention to light and composition, with an eye toward revealing character and behavior rather than just documenting physical presence. The creature in those photographs wasn't a monster. It was a being, intelligent, aware, capable of concern for another species' welfare. That message mattered as much as the physical evidence. We scheduled the press conference for October 15, 2019, at the University of Washington. The decision to hold it at an academic institution rather than through media channels was deliberate. We wanted to emphasize the scientific nature of the evidence, to present this as a zoological discovery rather than sensationalized entertainment. The university's main auditorium was packed. We'd sent advance notice to major news organizations, scientific journals, and relevant academic departments. The response had been overwhelming. Journalists from around the world, representatives from primatology and anthropology departments at dozens of universities, wildlife conservation organizations, and perhaps inevitably, representatives from various Bigfoot research groups. Maria Mercer Thompson sat in the front row, clutching a photograph of her brother taken a few months before his final trip. She'd insisted on being present, on bearing witness to the moment when Joshua's work would finally be shared with the world. Dr. Chen spoke first, presenting the scientific evidence with careful precision. He showed the DNA analysis results, explained what they suggested about evolutionary divergence, and discussed the implications for primate biology and North American ecology. His presentation was measured, professional, acknowledging the extraordinary nature of the claims while grounding everything in rigorous methodology. Dr. Rodriguez followed, detailing the forensic investigation and the recovery of Joshua Mercer's remains. She spoke about the landslide, about the evidence suggesting he'd been attempting to flee, about the camera that had survived when its owner hadn't. Her voice remained steady and professional, but I could hear the emotion underneath. Then it was my turn. I stood before that crowd of skeptics and believers, journalists and scientists, and I told Joshua's story. I showed his photographs, frame by frame, explaining not just what they depicted but what they revealed about the intelligence and behavior of the creature he'd encountered. When I reached frame 31, the creature's face in close-up, the expression of urgent warning, I paused. "This is what changed everything for me," I said, looking out at the audience. "Not just because it shows clear detail of an unknown primate species, but because of what it shows about that species' capacity for empathy. This being saw a human in danger and attempted to intervene. It tried to save Joshua Mercer's life." I showed the final frames, the chaos of the landslide, the creature running alongside the photographer, both trying to escape the same disaster. "Joshua Mercer died on that mountain," I continued. "But he left behind evidence of something remarkable. Not just that these creatures exist, but that they're capable of concern for beings outside their own species. That's not just intelligence. That's something more. That's a quality we usually consider fundamentally human." The auditorium was completely silent. I showed the modern footage next, our brief encounter during the expedition. The creature in the tree lean, watching us with that same intense awareness Joshua had captured 36 years earlier. "They're still there," I said. "They've always been there. And now we have a choice about what we do with this knowledge." The response was immediate and polarized. Major scientific journals demanded additional peer review before they would consider the evidence credible. Some dismissed the photographs outright as elaborate hoaxes, despite the authentication measures and the multiple lines of supporting evidence. The DNA analysis was questioned. Could it have been contaminated? Could the results have been misinterpreted? But others took the evidence seriously. Within days, primatologists and wildlife biologists from around the world were requesting access to our data, proposing additional studies, organizing expeditions to search for more evidence. The media coverage was intense and often frustrating. For every thoughtful article that engaged with the scientific implications, there were a dozen sensationalized pieces focused on "Bigfoot proves real" headlines. Tabloids ran wild with speculation. Conspiracy theorists claimed government cover-ups. The whole thing threatened to collapse into exactly the kind of circus I'd feared. But something else happened too. People started coming forward with their own stories. Loggers who'd seen something in remote clearcuts but never reported it for fear of ridicule. Hikers who'd found enormous footprints and felt watched by unseen eyes. Native elders who'd been told stories by their grandparents about the forest people who lived in the high country, avoiding human contact but occasionally helping travelers in danger. The sheer volume of testimony was overwhelming. Hundreds of accounts, spanning decades, from credible witnesses who'd had nothing to gain and much to lose by sharing their experiences. Individually, these stories could be dismissed. Collectively, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Dr. Chen received funding from 3 separate foundations to establish a long-term research project focused on what he termed North American forest hominids. The official name was deliberately bland, academic, but everyone knew what it meant. We were studying Sasquatch. We were treating them as a legitimate subject of scientific inquiry. Sarah Chen left her position at a conventional wildlife biology department to join Dr. Chen's project full-time. Dr. Rodriguez published a comprehensive paper on the forensic findings in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, carefully documenting Joshua Mercer's death and the circumstances surrounding it. And I found myself in the strange position of being taken seriously, not as a fringe researcher chasing legends, but as someone who'd made a legitimate contribution to zoological knowledge. But the most meaningful response came from Maria Mercer Thompson. 2 weeks after the press conference, she sent me a letter. Not an email, but an actual handwritten letter on good stationery, the kind of communication that requires thought and intention. "Thank you," she wrote, "for giving my brother's death meaning. For 36 years, I've carried the pain of losing him and the guilt of my last words to him. Now I know that his work mattered, that what he found was real and important, and that his final photographs serve a greater purpose. He died pursuing truth, and because of your efforts, that truth is now part of the world's understanding." Joshua would have been proud. I framed that letter and hung it in my office, where I see it every day. The discovery of Joshua's photographs and the subsequent evidence from our expedition raised questions that went far beyond simple zoology. If these creatures existed, and the evidence strongly suggested they did, then what did that mean for our understanding of intelligence, of personhood, of our place in the natural world? Dr. Chen and I spent countless hours discussing these implications, often late into the night, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The DNA evidence suggests they diverged from our evolutionary line somewhere between 3 and 5 million years ago, Dr. Chen explained during one of these sessions. That makes them closer to us than any other living primate. They're not apes that happen to walk upright. They're a sister species to humanity, beings that evolved alongside us, developed their own adaptations, their own intelligence, their own culture. Culture? I'd questioned. We have evidence of that? The shelter structure we found was definitely constructed, not natural, he'd replied. That suggests tool use, planning, knowledge passed between individuals. And the behavior Joshua documented, recognizing the danger of the landslide, attempting to warn a human, showing concern for another species' welfare, that suggests complex reasoning and moral cognition. He'd pulled up frame 31 on his computer, studying the creature's expression for perhaps the 100th time. This isn't an animal reacting on instinct. This is a thinking being making an ethical choice. It saw danger, recognized that a human was at risk, and chose to intervene despite the risk to itself. The implications were staggering. If these beings possessed intelligence and moral reasoning, if they showed empathy and ethical behavior, then what were our obligations toward them? How should we classify them, as endangered wildlife, or as something more? The question became urgent when logging companies began eyeing the areas where sightings had been concentrated. If these creatures weren't classified as anything more than unconfirmed wildlife, their habitat had no special protection. Old-growth forests could be cut, development could proceed, and their population, already small and vulnerable, could be pushed to extinction. But classifying them as something more than wildlife opened equally complicated questions. Were they persons entitled to rights? Did they own the land they inhabited? Who spoke for them if they chose to remain hidden? Sarah Chen proposed an interesting framework during one of our research meetings. We don't have to answer all these questions immediately, she'd suggested. What we need first is acknowledgement, official recognition that these beings exist, that they're intelligent, and that they require protection while we figure out the details. It made sense. And it gave us a concrete goal to work toward. The campaign for legal protection took 18 months and involved cooperation between scientific organizations, conservation groups, Native American tribal councils, and even some unexpected allies in the logging industry. Companies that recognized that being associated with the extinction of an intelligent species would be catastrophic for their public image. We presented testimony before congressional committees. Dr. Chen explained the scientific evidence. I showed Joshua's photographs and told his story. Representatives from the Nooksack, Lummi, and other tribes spoke about traditional knowledge of the forest people and the cultural significance of protecting them. Maria Mercer Thompson attended every hearing, a quiet presence in the gallery, bearing witness to the continuing impact of her brother's work. The opposition was fierce. Industry groups argued that protection measures would devastate the timber economy. Skeptics continued to deny the evidence, claiming everything from hoax to misidentification. Some religious groups raised theological objections about the implications of another intelligent species. But slowly, gradually, support built. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: satellite imagery analysis. Dr. Chen's research team had been studying high-resolution satellite photos of the Pacific Northwest, looking for patterns that might indicate habitation sites or travel corridors. What they found was remarkable: a network of shelter structures scattered through remote old-growth areas, arranged in patterns that suggested social organization and territorial boundaries. The structures were subtle, easily missed by casual observation, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. And they were widespread, not just in Washington, but extending through Oregon, Northern California, Idaho, and British Columbia. This isn't a remnant population on the verge of extinction, Dr. Chen had announced at a press conference revealing the findings. This is a viable breeding population, probably numbering in the low thousands, with established territories and social structures. They've been here all along, living parallel to human society, deliberately avoiding contact. The satellite evidence was harder to dismiss than photographs or DNA samples. It was objective, verifiable, and suggested a scale of population that made the need for protection undeniable. In March 2021, Congress passed the North American Forest Hominid Protection Act, legislation that designated certain remote forest areas as protected habitat, banned hunting or harassment of the species, and established a scientific research framework managed jointly by universities and tribal authorities. It wasn't perfect. The protected areas were smaller than Dr. Chan had recommended, and enforcement mechanisms were weak. But it was a start. It was official recognition that these beings existed, that they mattered, that humanity had an obligation to ensure their survival. On the day the legislation was signed, I visited Joshua Mercer's grave. Maria had buried his ashes in a cemetery outside Bellingham, with a headstone that read, Joshua Mercer, 1955 to 1983. Photographer, explorer, truth seeker. His final work changed the world. I stood there in the quiet cemetery, looking at that stone, thinking about the choices we make and the legacies we leave. Joshua had gone into those mountains chasing something most people dismissed as fantasy. He'd found it. He'd documented it. And even though the encounter had cost him his life, he'd kept photographing until the very end, preserving evidence that would eventually help protect an entire species. That mattered. That meant something. Despite all the evidence we've gathered, despite the legal protections and ongoing research, the forest people, as I've come to think of them, remain largely mysterious. They're still rare, still hidden, still choosing to avoid human contact whenever possible. Dr. Chen's long-term research project has documented dozens of possible sightings, collected extensive physical evidence, and mapped probable territories. But direct, sustained observation remains elusive. The creatures are simply too intelligent, too aware of being watched, too skilled at remaining concealed. We've learned some things through careful study. They appear to be primarily nocturnal, though not exclusively. They're omnivorous, with a diet consisting of plants, roots, small animals, and fish. They show seasonal movement patterns, descending to lower elevations in winter, returning to high country in summer. They live in small family groups, probably 5 to 10 individuals, maintaining territories of 20 to 30 square miles. But so much remains unknown. We don't know their lifespan, though it's probably similar to humans. We don't know the details of their social structure, their communication methods, or their cognitive capabilities. We don't know if they have language. Complex vocalizations have been recorded, but nothing we can definitively classify as linguistic. And most frustratingly, we don't know what they think of us. They clearly recognize humans as intelligent and potentially dangerous. Their avoidance behavior makes that clear. But Joshua's photographs suggest they're also capable of seeing us as beings worthy of concern, worthy of rescue. What does that mean about their ethical framework? Do they debate among themselves about how to relate to us, the same way we debate about how to relate to them? These questions haunt me. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that creature standing in Joshua's campsite, pointing urgently toward the cliff, trying desperately to communicate danger to a member of another species. I think about the choice it made in that moment, to approach rather than flee, to risk exposure rather than let a human die. What kind of being makes that choice? What does it say about them? And what does it say about us that we've spent centuries dismissing their existence, treating reports of them as jokes or hoaxes, while they've apparently spent that same time watching over us, sometimes helping, always remaining just out of sight? My life changed profoundly after finding Joshua's camera. The discovery that had seemed like a personal vindication opened up complexities I hadn't anticipated. I'm no longer a marginal figure chasing legends. I'm an established researcher with university affiliations, grant funding, and speaking invitations. The work I do is taken seriously. The questions I ask are considered legitimate. But with that legitimacy has come responsibility. To the forest people, to the scientific community, to the memory of Joshua Mercer and everyone else who saw these beings but couldn't prove it. I returned to the Goat Mountain area 3 months ago, on the 40th anniversary of Joshua's death. I hiked up to the ridge alone, carrying a print of frame 31, and I left it there, secured under a rock, facing the forest where the creatures still live. I don't know if they understand human imagery, if they recognize representations of themselves. But it felt important to leave it, a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, of thanks for the warning they gave Joshua even though it came too late to save him. I sat on that ridge as the sun set, watching shadows lengthen across the cirque, and I thought about everything that had changed since I'd first found the rusted camera in these rocks. And as darkness fell, I heard something. A vocalization from the forest, deep, resonant, unlike any known animal. Not threatening, not alarmed. Just present. Acknowledgement that I was there, that I was heard, that some form of communication was happening even if I didn't fully understand it. I didn't try to record it. Didn't reach for my camera or my phone. I just sat there in the darkness, listening, and I thought about Joshua Mercer and the creature that had tried to save him, and the strange, complicated relationship between our two species. Some moments aren't meant to be documented. Some moments are just meant to be experienced, to be felt, to be remembered in the quietness of your own heart. That was one of those moments. The existence of the forest people, if we can now speak of it as established fact rather than speculation, forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about our place in the world. We're not alone. We're not the only intelligent species on this planet, the only beings capable of complex thought and moral reasoning. We share the earth with others who think, who feel, who make choices, who build lives and communities in ways we're only beginning to understand. And crucially, we share it with beings who've apparently chosen coexistence over conflict, concealment over confrontation. Despite our expansion into their territories, despite our noise and pollution and destruction of habitat, they've remained hidden rather than engage in the kind of territorial warfare that has characterized so much of human history. That choice tells us something important about them. But it also asks us a question. What will we choose? Will we honor their preference for distance? Will we protect the remaining wild spaces that allow them to live as they've always lived? Will we recognize them as fellow inhabitants of this planet, with their own right to exist undisturbed? Or will we do what we've done to so many other species? Study them until the mystery is gone, encroach until their habitat is fragmented beyond sustainability, love them to death through our need to understand and document and control? These are the questions that keep me up at night now. These are the responsibilities that come with proof. Dr. Chen often quotes something that Tom Brightwater, the Nooksack elder, told him during one of their conversations. The forest people have always known about us. Now we know about them. The question is whether we're wise enough to let that knowledge exist without destroying what we've discovered. That wisdom, the wisdom to leave some things mysterious, to protect some things simply because they exist, to recognize that not everything needs to be fully understood or controlled, that's what we're being called to now. Joshua Mercer gave his life pursuing truth. The creature he photographed gave its warning trying to preserve life. Both actions, the pursuit of knowledge and the act of compassion, matter equally. Both are part of what makes intelligence meaningful, what makes consciousness valuable. We're being asked to honor both impulses, to seek understanding while also granting freedom, to document while also protecting, to know while also allowing mystery to remain. It's a difficult balance, maybe an impossible one. But it's the challenge we face now that the photographs have been developed, now that the evidence can't be denied, now that we know we're not alone in these ancient forests. 5 years have passed since I found Joshua's camera. The research continues. The protections remain imperfect but improving. Sightings are still rare, still precious when they occur. Last month, a trail camera in one of the protected areas captured something extraordinary. A female of the species, carrying what appeared to be an infant, moving through forest understory at dawn. The image was brief, slightly blurred, but unmistakable. They're still there, still surviving, still choosing to remain hidden, but now doing so with at least some measure of legal protection, with some acknowledgement from humanity that they have a right to exist. It's not enough. It's never enough when you're talking about a species whose population might be measured in the low thousands, whose habitat continues to shrink, whose very existence depends on humanity making better choices than we've historically made. But it's something. It's a start. I keep Joshua's photographs in a climate-controlled archive now, along with all the other evidence we've gathered. But I have one print, frame 31, the creature's face showing urgent concern, hanging in my office where I see it every day. It reminds me why this work matters. Not just for science, not just for proof, but because it shows us something we need to see about ourselves and the world we inhabit. We share this planet with others. Others who think. Others who feel. Others who choose compassion even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when the being in need is from another species entirely. If they can make that choice, then so can we. That's the real message of Joshua Mercer's photographs. That's the truth he documented in those final seconds before the mountain came down around him. And it's a truth worth remembering, worth honoring, worth protecting with everything we have. The forest people are still out there, watching from the shadows of old-growth trees, living their lives parallel to ours, choosing distance over contact but occasionally, rarely remarkably, choosing intervention over indifference. We owe them our acknowledgement. We owe them our protection. We owe them the wisdom to let them remain who they are, where they are, living as they choose. And maybe, if we're very lucky, if we prove ourselves worthy of their trust, we'll occasionally glimpse them again. Brief moments of connection across the species divide, reminders that we're not alone, that intelligence takes many forms, that compassion can bridge even the widest gaps. That's my hope, anyway. That's what I think about when I return to the mountains now, when I walk through old-growth forests where the light filters down in cathedral beams, when I feel the presence of something watching from just beyond sight. I think about Joshua Mercer, who gave his life pursuing truth. I think about the creature who tried to save him. And I think about the choice we face now, to be worthy of both their legacies. To pursue knowledge with courage. To offer compassion across all boundaries. To recognize that the most important discoveries aren't always the ones we can hold in our hands, but the ones that change how we see ourselves and our place in the vast, mysterious, shared world we call home. The camera I found on that mountainside in September 2019 was a Pentax K1000, manufactured in the late 1970s, built to last, designed to capture truth in chemical reactions and silver grains. Joshua Mercer carried it up into the Cascade Range in the summer of 1983, seeking something most people said didn't exist. He found it. He photographed it. And in doing so, he changed our understanding of what's possible, what's real, what shares these forests with us. The photographs developed from that camera, 36 frames exposed 40 years ago, preserved by luck and physics and the determination of one man to keep shooting even as disaster unfolded around him. Those photographs are now part of the scientific record, part of our collective knowledge about the world. But they're also more than that. They're a reminder that truth exists whether we acknowledge it or not. That some mysteries are worth pursuing even when everyone tells you you're wasting your time. That courage and compassion matter, whether they come from humans or from beings we're only beginning to understand. Joshua Mercer died on that mountain, but his work lives on. The creature that tried to save him is probably long gone. The lifespan estimates suggest it wouldn't still be alive today. But their descendants are still out there, still living in the high country, still choosing concealment over confrontation. Still surviving because Joshua documented their existence, and because that documentation eventually led to protection, and because sometimes, just sometimes, the right evidence comes to light at exactly the right moment to make a difference. This is that story. This is what happened when I developed 1980s film found in the woods. This is what those shocking photographs revealed. And this is what they continue to teach us, about the world we think we know, about the mysteries that remain, and about the choices we must make now that the truth can no longer be denied. The forest people are real. They've always been real. And now it's up to us to decide what we do with that knowledge. I profoundly hope, that we choose wisdom.